Partir, c'est mourir un peu. To live is to die a little bit. That's a quote from one of the characters in Zuleikha, and it provides an interesting kind of view of the themes of the book here. Zuleikha is a 2015 novel written by Guzel Yakhina. It tells the story of a Tatar woman called Zuleikha who falls victim to the dekolonization campaign in the Soviet Union and thus is exiled into Siberia. The book details Zuleikha's journey from her early life in a small village somewhere in Tatarstan with her desperate husband and terrifying mother-in-law to the loss of said husband and her exile into Siberia, the long journey there, and the various characters that she meets on the train ride to their settlement somewhere on an empty riverbank of Angara, and their collective attempts at survival. On the journey to Siberia, Zuleikha learns that she's pregnant with her late husband's son, so it's now imperative for her not only to live herself, but to help him survive. I first read the novel in 2020 during the pandemic, and I think I read this book, The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, and one of the books by Khaled Hosseini, I don't remember which one, but all of them in a row, and I don't recommend doing that, don't do that. They are all wonderful books, but what a downer. Zuleikha is not a particularly happy book. I don't think we can even call it uplifting, even though it has a happy-ish ending. It is introspective and reflective. But I also found it moving. Zuleikha's story is a story of perseverance, of resilience, of fortitude in the face of circumstances way beyond our control. Zuleikha is a victim of events way beyond her control, from her unhappy marriage to her exile to Siberia, but somehow she always manages to stay grounded. There is a bit in the book where Zuleikha sees the map of the Soviet Union and she compares it to a big red slug. And in that moment, she feels how small and inconsequential her life truly is in comparison to the greatness of the country. And yet, she still keeps going. She allows the current of her life's events to carry her wherever she needs to end up. She quickly finds meaning in her son and keeping him alive, but also in the process she also discovers who she truly is, and she transforms into someone she never imagined herself becoming. In the beginning, she is a small, uneducated girl from Tatarstan who believes in Allah, but also at the same time in the small deities of the forest, who cannot read or write, but has enough life skill to keep her afloat, who is vulnerable and compassionate, but also incredibly strong. And in the end, she becomes a woman who is in charge of her destiny as much as she can possibly be, who raised her son and kind of survived. Even if she is sometimes haunted by her past in the form of her mother-in-law's ghost, she has enough strength to push back against those prejudices that were holding her back and say, no, this is who I am now. I'm not ashamed anymore. And I found it powerful. The original title of the novel is Zuleikha Opens Up Her Eyes, which is used both literally within the text, but also as a metaphor for her rebirth, for her growth, for her realizing her potential. Same for some of the other characters. They also show this resilience of the weak, and they also remain humane in the face of terrifying circumstances. Like, for example, Dr. Liebe, who is taken from Kazan in a state that resembles like severe dementia, but then is explained via metaphor to be an extreme kind of form of escapism that he manages to shake off when his help is truly needed. Or Ignatiev, the officer in charge of the settlers, who gets stuck along with them in the settlement, who is their god, but also is, in part at least, responsible for their circumstance, and yet he does all he possibly can to keep them alive, because over the course of the journey he grew fond of them, but he also became one of them. Or the St. Petersburg intelligentsia who paint the views of Paris on the walls of their culture center to keep them grounded to who they actually are at the core, to keep their humanity. Zuleikha is a very personal story of people in the face of conditions that should break them, but they persevere. And this personal story is presented in the historical context of the 1930s, 1940s, Soviet Union, and all of its glory. You might not be overly familiar with the historical context here. The main points are there was this process of dekolonization. I hate the word dekolonization because it's раскулачивание in Russian and it has a much nicer ring to it. I will try to do it again. Dekolonization, in Russian раскулачивание, was a Soviet campaign of repressions, including arrests, deportations, executions of millions of kulaks and their families from the period of 1917 through 1933. The kulaks were a group of wealthy peasants who owned land and had workers working for them. And that went against Stalin's collectivization efforts, as in the Soviet Union there was no private property. To facilitate the expropriation of farmland, the Soviet government announced the liquidation of kulaks as a class in 1929, and thus the kulaks became the class enemies in the Soviet Union. The decision was made by the Politburo in 1930, and that meant that all kulaks were either shot or imprisoned, or sent to Siberia, the North, the Urals, or the Kazakhstan, or simply evicted from their houses and used in labor colonies within their own districts. Very real thing that affected not only the ethnic minorities but wealthy peasants across the board in an effort of redistribution of property and of collectivization in a communist country. That was imagined as a total liquidation of kulaks as a class that in reality manifested as confiscation of land and property, but also mass executions, deportations, and exiles. Handily, it also helped in conquering Siberia, a land that was largely uninhabited due to harsh living conditions. And so these people, these class enemies, along with real prisoners, were sent there to essentially create settlements, build infrastructure, and colonize the land. Since the allocation of funds and resources to prisoners and class enemies was not the highest of priorities, so the living conditions were abhorrent and the value of their lives was not that high in the eyes of their gods, so many of them didn't even make it to their settlements or died soon thereafter. This is what we see in the novel. Zuleikha's husband is deemed to be a kulak and is killed for attempted resistance. Zuleikha is a kulak's wife, so she's sent into exile to Siberia. As she travels there, many people die on the train even before making it to Siberia, and many more die at the settlement because the resources provided to them would be laughable if it weren't their lives at stake there. Obviously, this is still fiction, so take it with a grain of salt, but it is still very much rooted in an uncomfortable reality of the early Soviet regime and what it was willing to do. And that actually brings me to an object of fascination for me, and that is the reception of the book. Yakhina received a lot of criticism, and not the constructive kind, about historical accuracy, or rather perceived historical inaccuracy of her book. All of the comment sections are filled with really hateful comments about her being a Russophobe, maybe not such a controversial thing to be these days, about this book being anti-Soviet slop, also a weird stance to take, or even more inexplicably comparing her to Solzhenitsyn, but in a derogatory way. And that was a total wild card. I've never encountered this side of the internet before because I've always seen Solzhenitsyn being treated as a net good. I would imagine that such criticism is not present in the English-speaking corner of the world, but let's clarify here. The inspiration for Yakhina was her own grandmother, who at 6 years old was subject to dekolonization campaign and was exiled to Siberia, where she lived for 16 years. Yakhina claims that the idea for the book was spurred on by her quest in understanding her grandmother, what made her into a woman that she was, strong and kind of resilient one, I would imagine. And while the grandmother served as the inspiration for the protagonist of the book, Yakhina also read a lot of memoirs of other people who went through the same experience. Now, as far as I can tell, Yakhina doesn't claim total historical accuracy, so don't treat this book as gospel. However, it is also incorrect for us to completely disregard the atrocities of the early Soviet regime and how they treated their class enemies. Yakhina even says that she expected the criticism to be that she hasn't gone hard enough here. I personally do not know a lot of that period as far as kulaks goes, but I do know some as far as gulags go, so the events described by Yakhina here do not seem outlandish to me at all. And the picture painted is not a pretty one. From the murder of Zuleikha's husband by the Bolsheviks to the harsh living conditions on the journey to Siberia and there, and the meager supplies that were provided for them. And yet, many, many people seem to believe that such thing could never have happened, and the Soviet regime treated everybody with gentleness that it was known for. Personally, I didn't read the book as spiteful or defamatory, as some critics have done. It's more about remembering and reconciling these less stellar parts of the Soviet history here. Besides, it's still fiction. It does not need to be 100% accurate for it to be meaningful. Even if we assume that all of the kulaks didn't go through the same experience, and I do not think that we can go that far even, but even if we assume that it might very well have been for some, so it's still a story worth telling. Thus, dismissing the story because it fails at historical fact-checking by the dudes jerking off to the memories of Soviet Union might not be prudent either. Another angle of criticism comes from Tatars when it comes to Zuleikha's journey as a Tatar woman and also some of the customs described. Tatars are Turkic ethnic groups across Eastern Europe and Asia. The largest group amongst the Tatars are the Volga Tatars, mainly living in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan regions of European Russia, who are also often known as Tatars in Russian. They compose about 53% of the population in Tatarstan. Their language is Tatar, and as of 2010, there are about 5.3 million ethnic Tatars living in Russia. Now, I'm not trying to insert myself into that conversation. The Tatars can argue it out amongst themselves. They do not need a Slavic girl to weigh in here. Their argument made is that Zuleikha loses her identity as a Tatar woman over the course of the story, which I don't necessarily 100% agree here, but not my place to argue that. And another thing is Yusuf, her son, is completely Russified by the end of the story, which as an argument holds a lot more water. I do not think that it's a particularly terrible thing as far as the story goes, because it makes sense with how and where Yusuf grew up, but I can totally understand why it struck a chord with the Tatar community. As far as the portrayal of customs, I'm way out of my depth here. The only thing to mention is that Yakhina says that some of the customs described are true to her own experiences in her own family. Like, for example, hanging animal skulls on the gates, that's something that was done by her own grandparents. Honestly, since my own personal knowledge of Tatar culture is embarrassingly minimal, it was interesting for me to read what was happening in the book, and it might also be for you, and it might also trigger a little bit more investigation on our parts as readers and looking into that particular culture, so I will tentatively call it a net positive as well. I also found the language that Yakhina uses to be interesting. It often feels as if she's painting a picture with her words. Her metaphors and epithets are always very descriptive but not stuffy, so the book flows quite nicely. Overall, it's a personal journey story set against the backdrop of an often overlooked historical context and Tatar culture, so if anything that I've said here sounds appealing to you, check the book out. I think it's one of the good ones.